congratulations to all of you on making such a phenomenal, eye-opening film. Darius, let's start with you, why you wanted to make this, and also tell us about writing this with your brother.
Well, yeah, they're integrally linked, I think, ultimately. Really quickly, it started a very long time ago. The whole film is really decades old at this point.
Mm-hmm.
It began, but it reached me already many years into it. The story, the kernel of the story reached me 13 years ago within the first 30 seconds of meeting my friend Derek C. in France. And he was shooting a hybrid documentary at the time of a metal band that was in this kind of codependent, transient, moving world, completely real. They lived in a Winnebago, living in a very loud and crazy American dream. And Derek had actually, in his life as a metal drummer, suffered some tinnitus. So the two ideas really were there in the sense of this couple and Derek's experience with hearing loss to a much smaller degree than obviously Ruben's. And, you know, long story short, I ended up working on that story, and then I needed to start it from the ground up. I began writing, and sometimes you don't know the fullness even of what's bringing you to a story. I knew that I wanted this sound perspective. I knew I wanted this kind of cinematic language I hadn't experienced before. What I didn't fully know is how deeply personal it would become to me. And I think that was something very important about bringing my brother into the project. Abraham's Riz and Olivia, you guys know Abraham, and he's such a true north. He's such a poet and a deeply sensitive person. And he was really the person that I always talked to about stories. I always wanted to work things through with him. And we ended up in a house in the country just by happenstance. He was playing music while I was writing. We were eating meals together, and we just didn't stop. And we just kept going. And it was just very natural. But he really gave me permission in a certain way. He really helped me unlock some of this that was in me that was scary for me to put out. And, I think that partnership was essential.
Riz, you've had to learn a hell of a lot for this film. So first of all, as the film starts with it, why don't we start with the drumming? Who was guiding you through that? And were you a natural? I think you were. I think you probably were.
Well, I mean, I make music as a rapper, so I have kind of I thought I had some sense of rhythm, but it's very different kind of verbally keeping to a rhythm and physically playing it with I wasn't really a natural, to be honest. I found out pretty quickly. The first time I met Darius, how I came to the project was I loved the script, then I met Darius and I loved Darius. And then he put down this challenge of, I want whoever plays this role to really be playing the drums and to learn sign language. And I loved the idea of that challenge. Once I got started down the road, there were moments when I didn't love, the journey so much, and it presented its frustrations. But really, overall, it was a really enriching experience and a real gift to me as an actor and as a person to learn these skills, because both drumming and ASL, they're both kinds of nonverbal communication, really. And it really opened me up as an actor and as a person to kind of, to explore a different kind of embodied communication. My drum teacher was Guy Licata, and he was just incredible guy, very, very patient with me. And, something that he kept telling me was that you can't play the drums, you have to let them play you. You can't think your way to this thing. You just have to kind of surrender to it. And in a way, it's something very similar to what, this filmmaking process was. It was about surrendering to the uncertainty and taking these many leaps of faith into the process. And really, that was the way that Darius set up the whole filmmaking process, that we would have to kind of switch off our brains, do lots of prep, then switch off our brains and take a leap of faith. And that was down to just the style in which he was shooting, the number of takes which he'd like to do, the fact that we shot it in order. It was about kind of really living in the process. But the drums were maddening at times. But when I look back, I'm just so grateful for that experience.
I want to come on to the filming process in a bit, but Olivia, I want to ask you, who was your inspiration for punk rock queen Lou? She was pretty epic.
Oh, I was pretty lucky because my teacher, mentor, muse was a woman called Margaret Chardet of the band Pharmacon, and she taught me the guitar and how to scream and stuff. And then I just decided to just copy everything about her. And so it was a bit of a gift for me to just have her there.
Yeah. Did you have to like learn to scream without damaging your voice? That's what I was like worrying about from
You
like
just,
an actor
yeah, you
perspective.
just scream. There's no like finesse to it. You just scream and rest, and then scream and then rest. I had a vocal spray as well, which I didn't. It was from Whole Foods. I don't think it did anything.
Oh.
Is that a synonym for ineffective?
It was
yeah, but question.
It was made of burdock. It didn't work. No, but you guys did work on screaming a lot. And I think that what's interesting about screaming is that it's not that, you know, in theory, anybody can scream, but actually a lot of people can't. And I don't think it's so much that they can't physically scream, it's that they can't emotionally scream. Just the act of allowing it, you know, and I think that's what was so great about, it was actually really touching watching you and Margaret together, Olivia, because you guys really had a great connection, and Margaret's for real. Like, she is hardcore on the scene. Her shows, I've been to many of her shows. They are intense. And she is, but she's so gentle and nurturing. And so it was a really lovely combination of, she was really ushering an animal into, for you, like really saying, ah, you know, and, but at the same time, she was so nurturing. And I really, that was a wonderful process to watch.
Yeah, it was amazing because you do feel really uncomfortable and nervous to scream at first, and then she took me to a padded studio in the deepest, darkest bushwick, and she was just like, "Just do it, just scream." And I was like, "Oh, I just don't know, it's so embarrassing." Just scream.
It's kind of a gift, isn't it, to be able to scream? Like, when in life do we get to scream?
I feel like it must be so cathartic.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Everyone should do it. Should we all do it now?
For the sake of my ears, no, please don't. We've got a question from Shannon who wants to know, did you ever record any tracks to explore how the bands would sound, or were you just thrown right into filming the concert gig?
Who's that for? Me?
Let's go with you, Darius.
Well, the concert was practiced like crazy for so many months, you know, and I mean, Riz was practicing for 7 months, Olivia for, was it 2?
Yeah, I think so.
You know, but it was hardcore practice. So, but the whole experiment was, I mean, these guys were going to play in a live club with an audience, and the dare that I gave both of these guys from the beginning was, I'm not saving your ass. I'm not giving you a safety net. I'm not shooting you in such a way that I can cheat it later. I'm not going to do it. So you're only going to be as good as you get. And it's a horrible thing to say to an actor, because these guys, you know, the last thing you want to do is put yourself out there and look like a chump. But on the other hand, it dared them to really go for it and to achieve what they achieved. And as a matter of fact, just yesterday, I was looking at a video of you guys playing that I took while we were shooting. And, you know, it's so legit. It's so legit. And it's so fun to see how pure it is, you know?
Riz, those scenes where Ruben is losing his hearing, I know that you weren't just reacting to nothing. So can you tell us what was going on in that moment? You had something in your ears, did you?
Yeah, so, you know, Ruben has these kind of, his view of deafness evolves and regresses and swings back and forth over the course of the story. So sometimes, you know, understandably, given his experience as a hearing person, he sees deafness as a loss of something and as something that disconnects him from the world and himself. And at other times he starts to realize, even if he might not explicitly say it, that deafness is more of a culture and it's a world. And it's actually an opportunity to connect more with other people and more with himself than he ever has before. So in those kind of sections of the story where he sees it more of a loss and something that cuts him off, we use these auditory blockers. So they're basically like hearing aids that we modified to emit white noise and placed deep inside my ear canal. And they're quite tricky to get in and out. So, if they were in, they'd usually be in for, a large part of the day. And the effect of that is to, you can't really hear any external noises, but also you can't hear the sound of your own voice. And that is, quite disorienting. So it was something that we kind of decided to take this kind of emotionally led approach to, when he's feeling cut off in that way, to use those sound blockers. And I guess just an attempt to try and glimpse and respect the experience of that hearing loss, to try and ground it in something, authentic, outside of just the kind of research of talking to people.
And
that goes way back, though. It's just interesting to note. We hadn't talked about this a lot, Riz, but right from the very beginning, before, when you started drums, the discussion was always about, let's get out of here and just into the body. And just in general, let's not talk about it. Let's just get in the body. So learn the drums. And that just is a transference. That's just another level of that, which is just staying in the body, staying in a physical process. So that kind of, I think that embodies the whole process throughout shooting. It was always a physical process, not a cerebral process.
Olivia, I wanted to talk to you about the look of Lou, because that is so interesting. And it occurred to me, with your eyebrows dyed so pale, did you have to make your face even more expressive? I mean, you kind of have to make your face even more expressive anyway, because of how you're responding to Ruben. But yeah, tell me about that.
I was just over a breakfast with Darius and we were trying to discover Lou's look, and I think I was going through my Pinterest and was like, oh, what about this? I think maybe it was like a model or a Lady Gaga.
It was Lady Gaga.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
yeah, that's what it was.
And there was nothing other than it'd be cool to see what that would look like on my face with having big eyes, and then it just being that. But no.
No, wait. We have to talk, because I remember that conversation.
Okay, I can't remember it. Go on.
It was because you said this was actually something that you said to me at the time. It was about erasure. It was about being invisible. And I thought it was such a brave choice. It really came from you, which it's so brave because the eyebrows are so much about the expression of our face. I know, because I barely have any. This was about erasure. It was about disappearing. It was about the fact that Lou was hiding in the beginning. And that and I think it's what's shocking about it. It's shocking how deep it is. Because in fact, not that much changes aesthetically between, your hair changes, but like it's the eyebrows. It's that related to a sense of I think not just being invisible, but being invisible as a woman. I think the eyebrows are so much a part of that. Was our discussion at the time.
I remember now. It was trying to be as void of sensuality and sexuality as possible as well, in terms of the clothing. And I'm glad you said that, because now I can use that in further interviews, because I
anytime, Olivia, anytime.
Thank you.
Darius, there is a lot of pressure on the sound design when you're making a film about sound and hearing loss. So tell me about that process and your work with sound editor Nicholas Becker.
Well, it was an obscene process. It began a long time ago. I mean, I had this in my mind for so long. What's interesting is how hard it was to describe this to anyone. Right. It's funny, though, because it would seem like it wouldn't be that hard. It would seem like, yeah, it's a hearing perspective. We've seen it before in moments in movies. It was tremendously difficult to convey to people. And even people working in and on the film didn't realize it until later. They didn't realize the full concept of it, because it's it involves that approach from both a picture standpoint and an auditory standpoint. It has to cut and work in tandem. The sound design process was massive. I found Nicolas Becker, and that was very important. And we actually just formed a real bond way before shooting. Before I even met my DP, we were working on sound. So it kind of shows the degree of intentionality there. We were miking inside of skulls and going into soundless chambers in Paris and exploring what it's like to be in a non-sound environment and how you get sucked inside. And then that prompted the desire to actually mic inside Riz, which we ended up doing during shooting. And Nicolas would actually put mics down his throat and kind of, or in his mouth, and just like really feeling into, that's disgusting, Riz. And then, you know, so there was this actually natural library of sound that was very specific and very, very biological. And then afterwards, the sound editing happened before the mixing, and then the sound mixing. And all told, it was about 23 weeks of just sound work that is shock. It's just ridiculous. I mean, it's 6 times longer than the shoot. And that's just because I think we were pushing the envelope of something that nobody had heard before, you know? And so, and I would just say that was really an extraordinary and very hard process. I sometimes almost block it out of my mind, and my brother laughs at me. He's like, if you could flash back to what you were, to what a maniac you were for all of those weeks. And it's true. I go, oh my God, I was a maniac, but and really just like, nah, because it was like such a precise language, and you couldn't, it's really hard to understand that until you get in it. And the film ended up having about as many tracks as an action film. It's like 400 tracks deep, but it's so simple. And so it's just a fabulous process. And I mean, I hope I get a process that like rich and textural again, because it's just awesome.
Well, Alison has asked a similar question, but wants to know how you like achieved the effect of, you know, us as an audience feeling that we were losing our hearing as well, with like especially the low frequencies. And I picked up, especially when Ruben gets the implants and that initial
well, those
sound,
are
like
two
that
very different. Those are two very different sonic languages.
Yeah.
One of them's high frequency, one of them's low frequency. So the low frequency, the lack of hearing is true. You know, deaf people do not live in silence, and it's just a misnomer, and it's on some continuum, in some spectrum. There's usually always low frequency, but in order to create the low frequency, it's not as simple as it sounds. Like you can't just go, you know, press a low frequency button and voila. You have to actually create a bubble of sound, which is actually adding sound. So adding this kind of, there was some of that was about the miking of internal spaces that felt like a realm. So you feel like you're within a space that then you can't escape from. So that feeling you have in the film of being claustrophobic, that comes from the creation of a space you can't penetrate. And this is why I went so crazy, because if I picked up on a frequency that let you out, I would completely lose my mind, because if you were let out of that experience, you know, it doesn't work anymore. So it was about being trapped within and then entering into that low frequency language, which is a huge deep dive unto itself. We had an amazing Finnish Foley guy who actually, like, if you ever watch the pharmacy scene again, where he's in the pharmacy talking to, you know, like the footfall, for instance, every time he walks, you feel his feet hit the ground. You know, all that kind of stuff is very diligently created and recreated. It's not Riz's footprints. It's you know, it's all Foley, but it's all created to create this incredibly complex low frequency world. And then the last act is completely different. And that was a ridiculously complicated thing about dissecting every single sound and processing every single sound differently with different frequencies, and then actually put them on a spectrum of discombobulation, so that, because you actually have no directionality when you get the cochlear implant. People don't understand you've bypassed your cochlea, so you have no more low frequency at all. You have no sound. It's actual silence, which deafness isn't. So it's really extraordinary. I mean, a fun, crazy process. And for a long time, I was just pushing the envelope too far. It was always about, like, it had to be watchable, but I didn't want it to be comfortable. And and where is that line?
Well, speaking of discomfort, Antonio wants to know, Riz, how disorientating the experience was for you of playing without hearing.
Yeah, I mean, it was disorienting in terms of your bearings. I guess emotionally, lots of people adapt and adjust to living with impaired hearing or hearing loss, and they live very rich lives. So I wouldn't want to kind of like portray that experience as one that is inherently, a miserable one or a tragic one or anything like that. I think one of the big lessons for me and for Ruben is that deafness isn't a disability for many people, it's a culture. But I think the thing that Ruben is reacting to, and that perhaps I was kind of able to tap into a little bit with using those hearing aids, is that it's just a change. It's the abruptness of change. It's kind of having your bearings taken away from you. And I think it did actually kind of help me in certain ways, as I was saying, as an actor, because if you can't listen with your ears, you kind of have to listen with your whole body. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think the deaf community and that experience actually really taught me, is what the meaning of true listening is. I often say that Jeremy Stone, my sign instructor in the deaf community in New York, that he kind of welcomed me into, they taught me the true meaning of listening, that right. Deaf community. Mm-hmm. It's about attention and physical presence and the sensitivity of your body to someone else's energy. And that door wouldn't have been opened up for me had I not had that experience.
Mm-hmm. And Olivia, we see Ruben's journey and the person that he's become because of that, but we only really hear about Lou's. So how was that to come back in the third act and present a reinvented Lou?
It was all like it was planned, because I think what Darius did is keep Ruben and Lou's journey and mine and Riz's experience quite separate. Mm-hmm. So when you see Lou again in the last act, I had been away for maybe a month and a half, and Riz and Darius had this separate experience, and it was like reconnecting and getting to know each other again. And so there was this kind of initially this estranged quality to the performance, which I think really worked. And I wonder if it was just coincidental or not.
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, well, we had such a family, like it was so sad. Our process required us to say goodbye. Mm-hmm. And that was painful. And it was like so painful to have you leave, Olivia. Like it was so painful. Like we all talked about it, like, especially because like we were having dinner. It was just, while we were shooting, but we were such a family, and then it was horrible. It was like horrible to have that have to be true, but that's the deal with consequences. And it was actually really palpable to feel the process that you brought back to you back when you showed up back in Europe. And that was painful also. It was like, it was real. It felt physical. And I'll never forget that, honestly, what you brought to Europe with you. I'll never forget that experience as a director. It was very powerful. It was very specific, and it surprised me. And so I think in a funny way, even though that was my intention, it even surprised me how real it felt.
Yeah, you sometimes have no idea what you're channeling subconsciously until you have space from it.
I feel like I'm going to have a gaping hole in my life once I hang up and I don't have Olivia in my life either. But...
That's how it goes. That's how it goes with Olivia.
Darius, this was shot on 35mm, right? So tell me why you fought so hard for that.
Well, for every reason, I think. Number one, I don't love digital, and I relate to film. A film is an organic process that occurs. It really is burning light into an image, and it's different. So I just love film, number one. I also knew that if I didn't shoot my first film on film, that I'd never shoot another film on film. And now no one can tell me I can't shoot on film ever. And because if I could shoot this film on film, I can shoot any film on film. Mm-hmm. So I knew I was going to do it. It was a ridiculous thing to do, given what we were trying to pull off. But the thing I most like about it, honestly, was process. The aesthetic speaks for itself, but process was so interesting to me. I love that you have restrictions. I love that you cannot shoot all day, that it isn't just rolling. I hate that. I don't like the idea that you're like, let's try this and let's do this. And oh, maybe we should do this. I love intentionality. I love making a choice and living with it. And the other piece of that puzzle that I really love is no playback. I'm not fond of that. I don't like people sitting around playing back stuff and, prognosticating. I wanted us to shoot and move on. I asked it of you, Riz. Well, actually, the night before we started shooting, we had a wonderful discussion where you were like, I need to see my footage. And I said, you didn't say it like that. Well, yeah, you did. And I remember saying to you, I'm not going to be your enabler. That was my line. And you started laughing. But basically, it meant me walking the walk also. So I didn't look at dailies. Trusting in what you do, trusting in your choices, and staying present in what you are doing. And so film allows for that. And I quite like that.
So when limited takes are your reality, does that make you adjust the way that you prep and rehearse, Riz?
Well, I think what was interesting, I think, about the process is we didn't really rehearse. There were a couple of times when we met up and I think we've lost...
I'm still here. I'm still here.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah.
There were a couple of times when we'd meet up and kind of talk through, or actually just read a couple of scenes out loud without really getting too deep into them, just kind of spending time physically together and saying the words. I think we maybe did that once at your apartment. But it was more just about, shall we just get together? But aside from that, I think the preparation was more about trying to live into these characters and live into the process. So that was, lots of discussions with Darius. That was lots of discussions with our mentors, whether it was Pharmacon or whether it was, Sean Powell, from the drummer from the band Surfboard, and lots of people in the punk scene and the noise kind of scene, metal scene in New York that I was just interviewing, spending time with. Going to addiction kind of circles. And so I guess the preparation was, the drumming, the sign language, that it was more that kind of preparation. It wasn't preparing, okay, how are we going to do the scenes? What do we want emotionally from these scenes? It was about staying out of the results and again, trusting the process. And I guess when you have that kind of runway, or you kind of fight for that kind of runway to live into it and do that preparation, I guess you're able to make more of that leap of faith. I'm really glad that, in retrospect, that we had a limited number of takes, because I think when you know that you've got, you can play with more takes, you might think, what, let me just try this on this one, or let me kind of get warmed up, or let me just see where this goes. If you've got like one or two cracks at it, maybe three, then you're going, I'm not going to make any decisions. I'm going to kind of surrender. I'm just going to jump and go from the gut. And that's actually the best way to let all that preparation come to the surface, is not by controlling it, but by, unleashing it a little bit. So I really kind of think it's a beneficial process for actors in many ways, provided you can, you feel confident enough to take that leap. And when I look back at some of the other kind of films that I've done that have been, a very kind of condensed schedule and shot on film, like Shifty, I think actually we got a similar result in terms of, I don't know, just feeling like we were going from the gut,
Olivia, how did you find that process?
Yeah, I quite enjoyed it. I don't really like to spend too much time on one scene, because I do feel like I get worse as we go on, because I start to doubt myself. And I think what Riz was saying is completely right. You are just going off id, and as long as you are completely, if you know your characters so intensely like we did, then it all kind of flowed quite freely. And also Darius loves to just like get in there pre-production into your soul, and so there'll be, you know, you've got to trust that process as well, because he will just sometimes reference things that you've brought up just off the cuff, and you're like, oh, but you do have to trust that because he does get a good performance out of you doing that.
This actually,
get the subtext.
You know what I mean, Riz?
Sneaky guy.
Yeah.
This kind of follows on actually. Ravi is saying it's truly transformational filmmaking with incredible lead performances. What was the most essential piece of direction received from the director, and for which scene? Riz, let's start with you.
You know, it's hard to put your finger on it, because I think, as you're kind of gathering from what we're saying, is Darius really set up the entire filmmaking process with such intention, and he fought so hard at every moment to try and preserve, as he put it, an organic and authentic process. For example, we shot in sequence, you know, we aren't doing very many takes. We're doing months and months of prep. The effect of all of that is that you're living through the experience. You know, you're organically kind of, you know, one thing happens and then you shoot that once or maybe twice, and then the next thing happens and the next thing happens. You know, those aren't kind of obvious things. Anyone who's made a film knows it usually costs a lot more money and is a lot more hassle to shoot on film, to shoot in order, to shoot in sequence, to fight to give us months and months of preparation with these mentors. It's almost like setting up that process, setting up this culture of real trust, and leading by example as a risk taker. I think those are the conditions that you set up, so that once you're on set, it's really quite not hands off, but it's like you're in his hands, you know, because he set up that process. So in between takes, it'd be more about just, you know, how are you feeling, and just kind of encouraging and just kind of going, let's, you know, yeah, if you want to go again, let's go again. There was, you know, one occasion, I think, kind of makes me emotional thinking about it, when it was when he receives the diagnosis, you know, from the audiologist.
Yeah.
And I remember I was kind of like, you know, off in a quiet room somewhere, and we were filming in an office block, just kind of thinking, and, you know, breathing or whatever. And I remember just Darius just came into the room in kind of in tears, and just looked at me, and he went, you know, I don't know if he even said anything, and we just kind of looked at each other, and we just kind of nodded, and then he just left the room. And I heard that, I received it, you know.
That's beautiful. Olivia, did you have kind of a particular direction from Darius that you were able to really take on board and run with?
Yeah, I second what Riz was saying. It was all in the preparation, and I think once we were on set and completely in it, it was all about coaxing a performance, coaxing an emotion, especially for me in the last act when I came to Antwerp, and it was just all about using the qualities that we had now to our relationship and seeing where it went. And also just, he was very respectful and very gentle, and he was there in the room most of the times with you, and he was feeling everything that you were feeling. So when you've got a director like that goes through all these experiences with you, you kind of surpass traditional direction.
We've got so many questions from the audience. I'm just trying to like scroll through and find, there are just like loads, which is amazing. I think, is it Alicia wants to know about the writing and the directing. She wants to know about two particular scenes. I don't think we've got time for both, but she says they're beautiful and delicate. So let's talk about the conversation with Joe post-operation. Can you talk about writing that scene and directing it?
That I do. I remember when I found that scene, and it related to I mean, there's so many things running through that scene, actually, the last scene with Joe and Ruben. This concept, I don't know, I don't want to go too far into it, but I grew up in a spiritual community, actually, that was silent every weekend. So as a young boy, I was in this silent community, actually, on a goat farm. And oddly, that showed up a lot in this film. And there's one person I know who you know, you can meet a lot of religious people in your life. Every so often you meet a spiritual person, and that can have nothing to do with religion at all. It has to do with some kind of being tapped in. And that person talked to me once about, and you know when someone's tapped in, and at a moment of great difficulty, that person spoke to me about the one passage in the Bible that they held on to, which was this notion which is actually in the Bible, which is this notion of the kingdom of heaven being within. And I never forgot it. Like, it's so simple, but so powerful. And that person was very much alive in Joe. Mm-hmm. That person is in the DNA of Joe, and is very important and special to me. And having that relationship to Joe, as I found, allowed me to access a kind of a heartbreak in that scene that made it almost impossible to write. It was so heartbreaking. But that concept felt like one of the gifts that had been given to me. Mm-hmm. So I connected with the idea of what it would be to give it to Ruben.
Your relationship, Riz, Ruben's relationship with Joe is just phenomenal. It's just amazing. It's beautiful, and there's so much to it, so rich. So both I and Shannon want to know about working with Paul Raci, because he's so talented as well.
Yeah, he's an amazing guy, an amazing actor. He's a child of deaf adults himself, so he's culturally deaf. Mm-hmm. And he's a Vietnam War vet, just like the character Joe. He himself has an American Sign Language tribute band to Black Sabbath, so he's into metal. So in all these kind of ways, he was like this kind of father figure for Ruben to connect to, if only he could open up and surrender to that connection. But of course, he resists it. Mm-hmm. On set, he was also a kind of father figure in that he was a bridge between the hearing and the deaf communities. ASL is his first language, but of course he speaks English. He is himself biologically hearing. So he kind of occupied this really special space on the set where he was kind of holding space for all of us and advocating and balancing these worlds, just as Joe, the character, is. He's just a guy with a tremendous amount of heart and a tremendous amount of talent, and he just wears them both so lightly and effortlessly that being around him just kind of opens you up, and it's just such a gift to work with someone like that. That scene where we say goodbye is a scene where, there's the irony, I guess, of Ruben saying goodbye, this world isn't for me, but of course he's fluent in ASL by that point. So he's kind of signing with Joe saying, I shouldn't be here, mm-hmm. I should go. And I guess something about signing that scene made it more emotional. As I said, I think that you embody and inhabit your communication differently when it's nonverbal. Mm-hmm. And I think that was what's part of what kind of created a connection in that scene.
And also you had had a relationship at that point with ASL for 9 months. And remember, we're going chronologically, so that when Riz walks away from that, that's it, and it was a goodbye for both of them, for Paul too. It was a goodbye. So, it had that other meta quality to it. Mm-hmm.
And Jana wants to know if just more about your research process into deaf culture and the collaborative process with the actors, and what has the response been so far from the deaf community? Darius, start with you.
Oh, the response has been overwhelming. I mean, so overwhelmingly positive, which is really, if this film in some way offended or didn't resonate with the deaf community, it would be so heartbreaking to me. It would be so really so tragic. And so I'm really just, I feel so grateful that isn't what's happening. And my research was very deep in my experience, but really it was the research and the collaboration are the same thing. So deaf culture really represents itself on the screen. And there's so much nuance to that. And I would just say, like, dipping your toe into a culture, any culture, is always just crazy. From my days in documentary, it was always the same thing, moving into a different culture. It's just like, you just learn something every moment. And that's how it was within deaf culture. Every moment was a learning process. And I just opened myself up to that. As Paul would tell you, Paul was constantly like, nah, and everyone in the deaf community was like, no. And I just listened. I just took it in because I don't know, that's where it has to come from. And that happens in so many complex ways that even for the deaf community, I'd love them to know that, like, one way is really interesting is that Paul's character. Now, Paul, as Riz said, he didn't speak English until he was maybe 5 or 6. ASL is his first language, but that's not true of Joe. So actually the sign language that Joe uses is the sign language someone would use if they aren't culturally deaf.
Right.
There's great nuance to that. He's not signing as Paul would, because Paul is culturally deaf. He's from deaf culture. So and even the framing of the film actually is, my rule for myself, which is very complicated to film within deaf culture, because to ignore the language, to ignore the hands is disrespectful in itself. And there are times the camera cuts off the hands. But my rule, and so it's very tricky because you can imagine the power in film is in the eyes. There's nothing more powerful in the cinematic language than a close-up. But if you go for a close-up, you miss the hands. And so this is a very interesting and complex dance. And there are times, like, for instance, in that last scene with Joe and Ruben, where some of the sign language is cut off. My rule for myself shooting was, number one, the camera can't be smarter than the characters. So the camera's never pointing in this movie, which is, you'll see through and through. It doesn't point. It doesn't show you things because the camera is so nifty and smart. And that's true for sign language as well. But I never cut off the hands of culturally deaf people. Joe, the language is not from culturally deaf sign. So in that scene, there's this, you cut some of the hands in that scene from the camera, but that's because it's both of those people, Ruben and Joe, come from hearing culture. So those were my rules for myself. And I just think, like, that's how deep this thinking went, right or wrong. I had to make those calculations as I went.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, there are so many more questions. We just don't have time to get through them all. I haven't seen a response like this before in a Q&A online.
Oh,
so thank you so much, all of you, for watching. And thank you so much to all of you for joining in. Olivia, Darius, Riz, it's been such a pleasure. This film is obviously resonating incredibly well already. I can't wait to see what it's going to do in the future.
I have to say goodbye again to you guys. This is we never get to hang anymore. What is this?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Rhianna.
And thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha, as well.